Good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to this evening's discussion on the volume 100 Years of a Passage to India. We'll be joined by Ms. Anjum Hasan, Professor Howard J. Booth, Professor David Jasper, Professor Ruth Vanita, and the editor of the volume, Professor Harish Trivedi. Very briefly about the book, 100 Years of a Passage to India, which is part of our landmark series, commemorates 100 years of the publication of E.M. Forster's A Passage to India. It discusses the novel's context, themes, characters, and reception, including translations and adaptations, and its enduring status as a modern classic. Some of the foremost scholars of Forster's life and work from around the world engage with the novel in terms of contemporary concerns, including history, religions, mystery, politics, colonization, race, gender, identity, ethics, and the Anthropocene. Together with scholarly explorations, the volume also includes some creative speculations on the novel. I will briefly introduce the speakers for today. Professor Harish Trivedi, who has edited this volume, taught at the University of Delhi and was visiting professor at the universities of Chicago and London. He's the author of Colonial Transactions, English Literature and India, and has co-edited Kipling in India, India in Kipling, Literature and Nation, Britain and India, and Post-Colonial Translation, Theory and Practice. Professor Trivedi translates between Hindi and English. He also contributed a history of South Asian literature to Literature of World History. Ms. Anjum Hasan is the author of several works of fiction that have been shortlisted for the Sahitya Academy Award, the Hindu Literary Prize, and the Crossword Fiction Award, among others. She's currently a New India Foundation Fellow. Her new novel, History's Angel, has recently appeared from Bloomsbury. Her essays, short stories, and poems are widely published, including in the New York Review of Books, Granta, and in anthologies such as A Clutch of Indian Masterpieces, Extraordinary Short Stories from the 19th Century to the Present. Professor Howard J. Booth is a senior lecturer in English literature at the University of Manchester. He's the co-editor of Modernism and Empire, editor of the Cambridge Companion to Kipling, and the general editor of the Cambridge edition of the fiction of E.M. Forster, for which he is currently editing Forster's Morris. Professor David Jasper is emeritus professor at the University of Glasgow, where he was for many years professor of literature and theology. He has also taught in India, Australia, the United States, and most recently in China. He was the founding editor of the Oxford Journal, Literature and Theology, and the co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of English Literature and Theology. An anthology of his essays on the Bible and literature, Scripture and Literature, a David Jasper anthology, was published in 2023. He has been an Anglican priest for the last 50 years. Professor Ruth Vanita is the author most recently of the novel A Slight Angle and The Broken Rainbow, Poems and Translations. Her other books include The Dharma of Justice in the Sanskrit Epics, Debates on Gender, Varna, and Species, and Love's Right, Same-Sex Marriages in Modern India. She has translated several works of fiction and poetry from Hindi to English, most recently Mahadevi Varma's My Family. She taught for many years at Delhi University and later at the University of Montana. We thank the speakers for joining us today. I now invite Professor Harish Trivedi to chair the session. Over to you, Professor.
Hello, and thank you very much, Mr. Srinath. uh, for this introduction, and not only for the introduction, actually for being a wonderful editor at Orient Black Swan throughout the process of my editing, and then, of course, seeing it through the press, and, of course, printing and reprinting this book already because it's not done badly. The book that we are going to talk about looks a bit like this. You have already seen it perhaps on the poster that we sent out to people. And I'll say a little bit about this book, and then we shall have the four speakers, the panelists, talking to us about their own contributions and about other essays in the book. The series Landmarks was started by Orient Black Swan a couple of years ago, and the first volume in this was 100 Years of the Wasteland. All these modernist classics are coming thick and fast upon us. 1922 was The Wasteland, 1924, and this book was published last year, was A Passage to India, and this year there are already rumblings and celebrations of Mrs. Dalloway. So I was asked by them to edit this book, and I was delighted to do it. One of my favorite texts. But apart from the personal preference, I think the significance of the Passage to India is it is probably, very probably, the best novel ever written about India, not only by an Englishman, but I suppose by any Westerner. There was a long and intense interaction between Britain and India, mainly of a political and economic nature. But ultimately, apart from some impress, apart from some impact in different kinds of ways, what survives as a monument, what survives as a memorial, is a literary record of any period. And this is the significance for us in India of A Passage to India, that, as I said, is probably the best novel about India written by an Englishman. There is some competition there. Kipling has Kim, which he published in 1901, which I suppose would come to the minds of many readers. There is The Siege of Krishnapur by J.G. Farrell, which was the first India-related novel, even before Rushdie, to win the Booker Prize. And there are some novels by Edward Thompson, including one pointedly called A Farewell to India, not A Passage to India, but A Farewell to India. He knew Foster, Foster knew him. So there was a bit of banter between them when that novel came out. The other significance of A Passage to India is that regardless of its subject, regardless of its Indian dimension, it is probably the best novel by one of the best English novelists of the 20th century. It's a 20th century classic, regardless of what it talks about, what it deals with. So when putting this book together, I decided that I should invite a whole array of international scholars who have already published or who have been interested deeply in this book. And I arranged the essays, the 15 essays in this book, in groups of 3. The first being the reception of the novel worldwide, so that there we have essays. In fact, I wanted to just mention the names of all the contributors who are, of course, in no discussion can we have 15 contributors. Anjum is here with us. Rupert Snell contributed an essay on translating a passage into Hindi. He's taught Hindi in London and Texas. Evelyn Aqua Turner contributed a chapter on A Passage to India in French translation and reception. Christoph Fordonsky contributed an essay similarly to A Passage to India, reception and translation in the Soviet bloc. And I personally found it the most informative, the most fascinating, because we know so very little about the Soviet bloc and what happened to our scholars, to our writers there, the British writers. Madhu Singh has a chapter without which no book on this novel would be complete. The film that David Lean made on it. but she also had the treatment of two dramatic renderings, one by Shanta Ramarao of this novel in Foster's own lifetime. David Lillywell, in the second section, which is about characters and themes, talks about Aziz and the model, the real life model, Sayyid Ross Masood. Ruth will be with us, I hope, towards the end of this discussion. And David Jasper also is with us to talk about his own chapter. These are about Hinduism and Christianity in the novel, broadly speaking. Vinita Dhondiyal Bhatnagar has a chapter titled S. Miss S. Moore, the tragic case of Mrs. Moore in Foster's A Passage to India, the old lady who is hit so hard by so many things that happen in India in her old age that she meets with an unexpected ending. The Anamika, the Hindi novelist and professor of English, talks about Adela, the other major female character, in fact, the major character, and imagines an afterlife for her beyond the novel. Gaura Narayan from New York talks about race and gender in A Passage to India. Ipshita Chanda talks about A Passage to India, fosters ethics of engagement, and also brings in a scene in a cave, as there is in A Passage to India, also in a novel by Rabindranath Tagore. Howard is here with us, and he will talk about Passage to India and E.M. Foster and Rudyard Kipling, the obvious pair, the obvious comparison. Rukmini Bhaya Nair has contributed a chapter on putting together aspects of the novel, a book about the novel that Foster wrote published in 1927, juxtaposing that with the novel itself, The Passage to India. And finally, even I have written a chapter, apart from the introduction, about poetry and politics in A Passage to India. That is what the book contains. It's already been reviewed in a few places. There has been a discussion on it. And as I said, I'm delighted that it's not doing too badly, but it could do better if there is a further show of interest on the part of people who are listening to this discussion. I will, first of all, call among our panelists now, call upon Anjum Hasan, who has the first chapter in the book and who addresses the issue of how Foster was a champion of liberalism throughout his life, and liberal also in his attitude to the Raj and individual friendships within the frame of the Raj. Anjum, will you please talk about it? Anjum, are you there?
Hi, I'm sorry, having a little bit of network issues, but can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I can see you and hear you. Yeah.
I've been hearing about every third word that you spoke.
I'm hearing
So
every word of yours.
that's wonderful. Oh, suddenly I can hear you actually. So I hope that lasts. But did you want me to speak about the essay first?
About liberalism
Yes,
as Foster's creed,
yes,
and about how even in the frame of the Raj, of the
yes,
imperial rule,
yes.
he laid emphasis on individual relationships rather than politics. And of course, if you bring in your father, whom you bring in your essay, that'll be wonderful, because he was a tremendous champion of Foster.
Yes, and my essay is very much about my father's and to the novel, and through that, my attraction, having been sort of brought up on Foster, as it were. But to start with the liberalism, I mean, Foster, of course, calls himself a liberal and an individual. But it's a curious, very tentative, personal, like you said, idea of the liberal. Somewhere, I think it's in aspects of the novel about two movements of the human mind, the tedious onrush of history and the sideways crab-like movement of humanity. And I think Foster's liberalism was always very much about going against the grain. He described it in his nonfiction, and I think he exemplifies it wonderfully in Passage to India, this idea of answering to power through things that are much more standing up to power through things that are more minute, more mystical in a way, ephemeral, but more important. And I think that was the spirit of friendship, personal relationships, tentativeness, I think even failure, the failure of the central friendship in the novel. All of these things, I think, were the things that attracted my father to the novel. And of course, he was not just an enthusiast, he was a critic, a professor of English literature. So he wrote about the novel in a critical vein, but I think it always came back to the idea of affection. How do you write about a novelist you love rather than a novelist you are trying to take apart? And I noticed somewhere, I think in our anthology, mention of how Foster criticism latterly has been much more about the political and the historical, much less about the liberal individualist, humanist aspects of the novel. And I think in my little essay, I was trying to reclaim the personal, which was easier to do, I think, partly because, like I said, my siblings and I were sort of lined up to listen to Two Cheers for Democracy. It was a BBC talk, I think, that Foster gave. And here we were, like at 10 years old or 8 years old, listening to it. So I've always had this idea that Foster's one of the sort of deities, family deities. So it was easier to come at it from a personal sort of point of view. And I think there is enough in the novel to sustain that reading still, despite this long history of post-colonial readings and criticism that brings in things that have been earlier missed, gender, caste, historical connections, his orientalizing, his sort of missing things about India. All of that is there, and I point to some of the ways in which that happens. Character of Aziz. I think he sort of romanticizes Aziz as a sort of Muslim Oriental figure, and I point out in my essay that in fact Aziz is a very modern, early 20th century, westernized Indian Muslim. So I can come back a little later, maybe in the discussion, to another essay in the book, which I think is a wonderful companion to mine, which is also about the modern Muslim in this period, more specifically Syed Ross Masood, who was the great inspiration for Foster in writing Passage to India. But yeah, I think I've said a little bit about broadly what the essay is and why I think Foster's liberalism is still very attractive. I mean, I just reread Two Cheers for Democracy, and it's so uncannily prescient because he says things are getting worse. We're writing at a time of rising nationalisms, rising creeds, rising sort of a sense of the general values rather than the more particular creative individual values. So it's incredibly prescient, I think. So I still think, I mean, I hold Foster very dear, like my father did. But that's like sort of taking apart the figure of the Muslim and how David Lelywell's essay in the anthology really helped me to see what I was trying to do better. Should I come back to that in a while? Because I think I've used up my 7 minutes. I think you're muted, Harish.
Yeah,
You're
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they don't trust me. They think I'll butt in between.
You were
but
muted.
but yeah, who can mute me? Only they. But Anjum, take a minute or two more and say it
Right.
now because the format is. Then we go on to the next person. Yep.
Yes, yes. And I never know with this network. I can't, the network is going to mute me if not Srinath. But yes, I am very fascinated by Aziz on my rereading. I discuss in the essay how I read the novel as a teenager, and it's a wholly different sort of impression one gets reading at that age as compared to reading as a much older, more sort of critical, hopefully, point of view that you bring to it. Reading a novel that's 100 years old. And one sort of takes Aziz for granted as this very sort of figure who's full of feeling, writing poetry, wants to be friends, making overtures, not sure. And that's the impression that remains with you. But when I read the novel now, I see that Aziz is, in fact, trying to be a modern Indian nationalist of the Nehruvian generation, but seeing how he can do that while retaining his fidelity to the idea of Islam. And it's an idea of Islam. He's not necessarily a very pious Muslim. And in the essay, I compare that to a book that was written almost at the same time as Passage to India, also by an Englishman who was very sympathetic to Indians, and that is C.F. Andrews. Everyone knows, I think, who C.F. Andrews was. Fewer people might know that he wrote this wonderful little book called Zakaullah of Delhi, which is about a very progressive Indian Muslim Sharif of Delhi, who was a translator, he was a writer, and I thought it was very interesting to compare these two books written by two Englishmen at the same time with prominent Muslim characters. And the two men, the characters, one, of course, is a real life character, the other is a fiction, but they are actually very different. The older man, Zakaullah is about 2 generations older, is in fact a very clear-minded votary of empire. He thinks the British Empire needs to be in place for Indians, in particular Hindus and Muslims, to live together. We need, in his view, a benevolent Queen Victoria, but at the same time, he's very proud of being a Muslim, progressive, trying to bring a modern European style education into Urdu. He did a huge number of translations. He was
Yeah.
a teacher. He was involved with Sir Syed Ahmad Khan in the movement that he started for a modern education and so on.
Yeah.
And I just
Anjum,
thought
I'm
it's
delighted. Anjum, I'm delighted that you did bring that in. And I've not seen a juxtaposition of Foster's novel with Andrew's book Zakahullah before. That's completely original. And it gives a historical depth to the character of Aziz. But I'm afraid we must move on now. I'm glad you got all that in very quick time. Thank you. And
Thank you
we'll
so
see.
much.
We'll see where Howard Booth is. Has he been able to log in? Howard?
I'm here, Harish.
Oh,
Yes.
great, great, Howard. Yes. We've been talking, as you must have heard, about liberalism and about how Foster was a great champion of it. And the essay that you have contributed is about Foster's views of Kipling as they evolved over a long time. And as he expressed them in book reviews and little comments here and there. Now, the very first sentence of your essay is that Foster has been thought to be a liberal and Kipling has been thought to be an imperialist, but it's not so simple as that. So please complicate that picture for us further. Yes.
Yes, I think that's a kind of a way into the essay that might have surprised some people because clearly, as you've been hearing, liberalism was very important to E.M. Forster. But it's worth saying that our word liberal means different things to different people and different things in different times. And Forster's early identification was with the so-called new liberalism in Britain, and that advocated state intervention, for example, in education or the welfare system. And he saw that as necessary before you could have individual personal development and the kind of connections that he explores in The Passage to India. And of course, in that essay that we've just been hearing about, what I believe in the collection Two Cheers for Democracy, written just before the Second World War in Europe, Forster saw himself as someone who has, and I quote, who has found liberalism crumbling beneath him. And perhaps one way of thinking about A Passage to India is a novel written by somebody from Britain who is finding old certainties that underpinned colonialism, crumbling, giving way beneath his feet. It's an extraordinary image. And then what I go on to do in my chapter for our book was to note how Forster engaged with and reworked forms of British colonial discourse about India. And seeing Forster's response to India in A Passage to India as just one marker along the way of a long journey of thinking about colonialism, British rule in India, was, after all, only after the novel was finished and published that Forster came to support Indian independence. And given his class background, his education, English upbringing, it can be said that he only gradually and imperfectly thought his way out. That was quite a task for somebody of his time, out of the attitudes of the imperial Britain that surrounded him. And his two visits to India and his period in Egypt during the First World War really were, I think, a part of Forster's education, just as much perhaps as Cambridge. As Harish says, I look in my piece at how Forster developed his views over a long period in negotiation with Rudyard Kipling, and took, broadly speaking, we'll complicate that, an increasingly questioning view of the older author. We could say that if anybody in the first part of the 20th century was going to write in English about India, they did so in the shadow of Rudyard Kipling. Rudyard Kipling was the dominant voice representing India, and this is the high point of print culture, of reading as the main form of mass entertainment, of informing people. There's no radio and film as yet. And Kipling sold worldwide, not only to those who read in English, but he was also available widely in translation. There was then the India Forster encountered, what he came to feel he wanted to say about it in his novel, but he would also have been very well aware of the India his readers had heard about, a representation they accorded really the status of truth, and that was the version of India they got from Rudyard Kipling. So Kipling was, I think, an imperialist, but I am going to complicate that, as Harish quoted that first sentence of my piece for the collection. He held no illusions about what empire involved, not for him narratives of bringing development, education, bringing religious truth. In a world where nations competed, for Kipling, one should fight to come out on top. That was the only thing one could do. And when rule was established, one should be prepared to use force and violence to maintain it. And crucially, the British should keep their distance from India and Indians. Many of Kipling's short stories set in India see Anglo-Indians, as the British in India then called themselves, coming to grief as a result of becoming fascinated with India, its peoples and its cultures. And yet, of course, as Rish has already mentioned to us today, Kipling is not consistent in this. He's a writer who in other texts is fascinated by the land in which he was born, and that's most of all shown in his novel Kim. Now, Ian Forster's very last known comments on Kipling aged 80, were made over lunch at his club in London with his future biographer, P.N. Furbank. And Forster Riley observed that he had, when in India, lectured on Kipling, and I quote, admiringly. And his audience, this is Furbank reporting Forster, though polite, hadn't believed a word of it. They knew it could not be true of that monolithic imperialist. Now, many of you listening to me here may have a somewhat sort of similar feeling. Surely Kipling is monolithic, but I think for Forster, he wasn't. And Forster, which I think is sustained by a careful reading of Kipling, realized that Kipling had a complexity to him. There's a deep fascination with India, but also an anxiety about engaging closely with India. There's violence, there's recoil. So Forster was someone who knew he had to negotiate with this recent writing, and his own response to Kipling was to see him gradually coming to terms with the man and his work over a number of short responses. By the early 1940s in radio broadcasts, he was sharply critical of Kipling's racism and imperialism. And yet in that same late table talk with P.N. Furbank I've quoted from, Forster also says that Kipling, and I quote, was one of the few people he deeply regretted not having known. And if I had to venture what lies behind this, it would be that Forster thought deeply about the craft of writing. He thought deeply about the plots he'd inherited, the styles he'd inherited, and what they would and what they wouldn't allow him to do. And he responded to Kipling, the fellow literary craftsman. And we also see that reworking of Anglo-India, its plots and its narratives in Rudyard Kipling, in Ian Forster's response in A Passage to India to the 1857 uprising, which Gary Naran very sort of sensitively explores in her chapter for our collection. So that's a little bit on that relationship between Ian Forster and his most sort of famous predecessor as a British writer about India, Rudyard Kipling.
Yeah. In your chapter, you quote Forster as asking the question, can an immature person be a great artist? And Forster then said, the answer is yes. What do you agree with that?
Oh, well, that's a very big general question.
Yeah.
One of the really interesting things for a Kipling scholar, right, someone who's as well as a Forster scholar, a Kipling scholar, about Forster's response to Kipling is that he notes and discerns a certain kind of limitation of vision in the writing. And he says that in many occasions, biographical readings of authors don't help. But with Kipling, they do have a certain force. And he is very insightful, I think, in realizing with Kipling that early forms of damage, trauma, we might now say, had in adulthood resulted in a certain kind of compression of his own ability to be sympathetic towards others, in Forsterian language, to connect. So he actually has a very insightful view of Kipling, the person. But in answer to your question, I think he also discerns, and this is a very interesting point again about Kipling, that someone positioned in that way can still write very powerfully, that there is no connection between great writing, powerful writing, and writing that we agree with, find true, or that is not dangerous. So he's a very interesting reader of Kipling, I think.
Thank you very much, Howard. Thank you. Yes. Our next speaker will be David Jasper. He has degrees in, do we have you here on screen, David?
Yes, I hope
Right.
you can hear and see me.
Wonderful, yes. And you have degrees in both literature and theology, and the combination of the two has been running through your work. apart from that, I think of all the contributors to this book, you have lived closest to the city where the novel is set, in the novel called Chandrapur, but otherwise Bakipur, which is a part of Patna. And you spent a couple of years there in the 1970s. You have talked in your chapter. Tell us a bit about your experience of India, having read A Passage to India and being on A Passage to India territory. And after that, you have, being an atheist, Foster says, well, he seems to mock all religions, Islam, Hinduism, and Christianity. But his treatment of Christianity is, I think, the shortest in the book, and shortest in all senses. He has these phrases about poor little talkative Christianity, love in a church, love in a cave, what's the difference? He has two missionary characters who are like pariahs, who have self-exiled themselves from British society. With all this, you juxtapose some real-life characters who were Christian missionaries at that time, and not at all like Foster's missionaries. Tell us something about that.
Thank you. Well, that's a lot to speak about in a few moments, but I'll try and draw some of those things together. And the first thing I'd really like to say is that the book that we've all participated in and you have edited, 100 Years of A Passage to India, illustrates, I think, very well the novel as a space of literature, a kind of echo chamber that prompts many overlapping and different readings from which no reader or critic can finally disentangle themselves from their own perspective, and I certainly include myself in that perspective being governed, consciously or otherwise, by things religious, cultural, and experiential. It is not, I think, finally, a novel about relationships. Forster once hesitantly wrote that it is, or rather desires to be, philosophic and poetic. A Vedantic novel, perhaps, Vedanta not being religion, but rather a way of looking at the world. Or it's been described by another critic as a mandala, an archetype of wholeness and unity in the context of disordered multiplicity. Of course, religion in its various forms, and sometimes without form at all, is everywhere in A Passage to India. Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity too, coexisting rather clumsily in the fraught cultures of early 20th century India, and distorting that almost central silence of Professor Godbole and his Lord of the Universe, who is, was not, was.
Yes.
Now, my own chapter in the book follows that of Ruth Vanita, and rereading them both again in the last day or two, I'm aware of how the novel prompts at once differences and similarities in its readers. And yet even here in this novel by an Englishman, there is somehow the sound, that's not an oxymoron, of the eternal silence of India. Professor Vanita, who we'll hear in a moment, regards the English characters as all variously irritating or petty, which I agree, indeed they all pretty much are. While I, for my part as a reader, contemplate the Indian characters necessarily as an outsider, condemned as I am to read the book as a confessed adherent of poor little talkative Christianity. As has been mentioned, I have been for many decades an Anglican priest. But I ask the question, who of us has, in the end, the right credentials to claim to be proper readers of Forster's novel? Even 100 years on, it continues to read us. my own experience, I confess, inseparable from that time when I was living in India, very close to Patna, in the very early 1970s. Gosh, almost 60 years ago now, as a very naive, very young school teacher in a Christian school. History has left its mark on all of us, and our necessary, inevitable misinterpretations of literature, just as it left its mark on Forster himself, and indeed on all the characters of the novel, except perhaps one. As a poem, it unpicks every religious tradition, and leaves us perhaps only with Godbele, coming closest to achieving unity, the temple of the final section, not the echoing cave, being the centre of all things. Yet subject even there, as always, to the absurdity and perhaps carelessness of human interpretation. God, see, love, as the notice says. Is this the final message of India? Perhaps, and that word is always necessary, perhaps, aside from the inscrutable Godbele, as Ruth Vanita points out, every character has his or her typical prejudices, whether it be Aziz, Adela, Ronnie, Fielding, Mrs. Moore, all of them. But if the novel is not really, in the last instance, about characters or their relationships, because I think such is to miss the wood for the trees, then we cannot escape the judgments of their lives in India. As you've mentioned, Harish, though often overlooked, are the two briefly mentioned English Christian missionaries, old Mr. Graysford and young Mr. Sawley, rather absurd characters who lived out beyond the slaughterhouses, always travelled third class on the railways, and never came up to the club. Yes, they are comic and rather pathetic, but they are trying to do their best in their way. Outsiders in India in two senses, from both the British and the Indian communities, and it's because of their religion. Or then there's the brief moment in the novel of the nationalist meeting of Hindus, Muslims, two Sikhs, two Parsis, a Jain and a native Christian, who only managed to agree as long as someone abused the English. Ruth Vanita rightly emphasizes the muddle that is associated with all the English characters. But I would dare, if I may, to take her comment one step further. For in the complexities, there's muddle for everyone. And if characters do not create a muddle, then they do inhabit a muddle, with the ensuing division, chaos, and misunderstanding. Mrs. Moore states, of course, that she dislikes muddles, but likes mysteries. But for her, every mystery inevitably becomes a muddle. Above all, in Ruth's words, in her grave mistake of taking the echo in the cave as a statement about the emptiness of existence. For Adela, the muddle ensues upon her pronouncement of doubt. I'm not quite sure. And such an uncertainty is a thing that the British imperialists could never admit. Forster's sources for his poem of India, of the poetic passage out after Whitman, like my own sources, are complex, unstable, intellectual, personal, all mixed up. Memories and their echoes, friendships, perhaps above all Masood, books. And no sources, of course, are straightforward, or we might say untainted. For example, he claimed that E.B. Havel's 1911 book, Ideals of Indian Art, opened an epoch for him. And indeed, Havel's words still have a resonance in their description of the aim of Indian art. which he says is not to extract beauty from nature, but to reveal the life within life, the noumenon within phenomenon, the reality within unreality, the soul within matter. There's nothing common or unclean in what God has made, but we can only make life beautiful for ourselves by the power of the Spirit that is within us. Well, however true or not that may be, even this is a reductive description generated from many sources itself, the conventions of art history, certainly the ideals of European Romanticism, and the negative or apophatic theologies of Christianity or other Eastern religions. But it seems to me that the cultural complexity was inevitable in a novel that is yet, or at least aspires to be, a poem, a Vedantic novel. In 1913, Forster wrote to Forrest Reed of his writing that he wanted to say something beyond the field of action and behavior. And at its centre, perhaps, there is Godbelay, elusive, hardly participating in the brittle world of British imperialists or Islamic Aziz. Indeed, to Aziz he's dear old Godbelay. And yet he stands in the presence of God, the God who is ancient yet not born, God and Godbelay at opposite ends of the same strip of carpet.
Thank you, David. Thank you. That was, apart from you saying wonderful things, that was a very well crafted piece in its own right.
Thank you.
You made Ruth's task easy to some extent and complicated it in some other ways. But I'd just like to mention that in your essay, the two missionaries in the novel, Graceford and Sorley, though comical and pathetic, as depicted by Foster, are in your essay historically counterpointed by two real-life missionaries who came out to India, C.F. Andrews and Verrier Elwin, who are extremely unlike Graceford and Sorley. So there is fiction, there is Foster's atheism on the one hand, and there is another spirit, another endeavor of Christianity in India as represented by Andrews and Elwin. And that makes a very nice contrast in your essay. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Yeah, right. Ruth,
okay.
Do we have you here with us? Ruth had problems logging in, connectivity. Sometimes it happens. Ruth, do we have you?
She joined.
Hi, Ruth. Can we see you? Can we hear you?
Hello. Yeah, hi, sorry. Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, oh yeah, I can see you too. See you and hear you.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, one of the participants here has really done what I suggested when I initially wrote to all of you, which is to talk about not only their own piece, but how similar themes are developed in other pieces. So David has taken the game to you. Will you take it back to him, or will you go along your path of explaining how it's a Vedantic novel and not a Hindu novel, because the two are not the same thing?
Well, you suggested to me that I should sum up my essay and then add a few lines on Islam and Christianity, so I'm going to do that.
Yeah, right. Okay.
That if Vedanta is the theory, Hinduism is the practice, perhaps, but
yeah. Mm.
Vedanta novel, the term was coined by S. Nagarajan in his analysis of Ishtavar's A Single Man. So anyway, picking up where David left off, he quoted Foster of 1913. I'm going to give a little more of that quotation. Foster said, I want something beyond the field of action and behavior. The waters of the river that rises from the middle of to join the gas and the Jamuna, something wider than politics about the search of the human race for a more lasting home. That is why I have a title passage to India from a famous poem of Walt Whitman's. So notice the word something, which recurs at crucial moments throughout the book. The novel is about the search for that something. My wish after something. You and I and Miss Quested are, roughly speaking, not after anything. So Vedanta views not only Hindus but all beings as searching, however, unconsciously for oneness. Therefore, the Vedantic novel need not be about Hindus or even about India. In the novel, as in Whitman's poem, India is a passage more than India. Forster's statement elsewhere, I do not believe in belief, addresses the core of Vedanta thought, which is the pursuit of belief, but of knowledge. So the river, of course, that Forster refers to as expressing his intentions in passage, the one that rises to join the Ganges and Jamna, is Saraswati, the river goddess of knowledge. So most of the individual characters, both British and Indian, are not looking for reality, but a few are groping towards it. And the narrator hints throughout at the oneness of this reality. I quote, "Beyond the sky, must there not be something that overshadows all the skies?" Forster appreciates Islam's aesthetics, but he finds that its idea of ultimate reality lacks in philosophical depth. I quote, "The shallow arcades mosque," the narrator says, "provided but a limited asylum. There is no good but God, doesn't carry us far through the complexities of matter and spirit. It is only a game with words, really, a religious fun, not a religious truth." The same is true of what he characterizes in that brilliant phrase as poor little talkative Christianity. Mrs. Moore has a glimpse of infinity in the wasp, but she dies in a muddle because, I quote, "The universe never comprehended to her intellect, offered no repose to her soul," unquote. She makes the grave mistake of putting the echo in the cave. Mistake
Hello, is there a problem in connectivity?
Yeah, Professor Vanita seems to be having connectivity issues.
Yeah, that's what I thought. We can't hear her or see her anymore. Is that right?
Yeah.
So what do we do?
Shall we move to another round of comments?
What I can do is, as I had explained, let me be a ventriloquist on behalf of Ruth Vanita. From the chapter that she has written, I'll read out one or two little extracts to present her argument to the people assembled here. And after that, we shall perhaps go on to take questions. I will also make a few remarks about the book generally, and then for 5 minutes or so, and then we can go beyond to take questions from the audience. Is that okay? Shall we go ahead with that?
Yes, sure. And
Yeah.
we'll request all the listeners to type in their questions in
Yeah.
the Q&A box. Yeah.
I couldn't adjust a page of it, and now I can back.
Can we, Ruth? We can't.
Hello,
Ruth,
can you hear me now?
no, we can't hear you, and we can't see you. It began very well. It began very well, but now connectivity is a major issue, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. What I'll do is, as I've just said, I'll read out something from your essay to give some idea of the kind of argument you have developed here. And then I hope that if connectivity improves, then when the questions come in from the audience, and there is something concerning you and your piece, then we'll see whether you can come back in and respond to that.
Hello,
yeah,
can you hear me now?
Yeah, slightly better.
You can't.
No, it's very patchy.
Okay.
It's very patchy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, you tried and we tried, and we saw you and we heard a bit of you. But you know, technology is still not what ideally it should be. No.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Well, you
it is.
have one, but maybe you can read the rest.
I'm sorry, there is a mismatch between the image and the words as well now. So it's a bit difficult.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, what Ruth has done in here is, of course, as I said, to talk about it not in terms of the third part, which most people take to be about Hinduism, but the whole novel to be a Vedantic novel and not about Hindus. She says it pursues not belief but knowledge. Foster said before he came out to India to a friend that he wanted something beyond the field of action and behavior. This is how Ruth's article opens. I want something beyond the field of action and behavior, Foster wrote. Uh, the waters of the river that rises from the middle of the earth to join the Ganges and the Jamuna where they join. He said that in a letter. So he is, in a way, before he begins writing the novel, or perhaps when he's just started writing the novel, he came to India in 1912-13 for the first time, and then in 21-22 for the second time, in 1945 for the third time. So very early on in his first-hand acquaintance with India, he's read up something. I don't know. I didn't know that Saraswati sprang from the middle of the earth down there. Uh, and Saraswati was actually, an actual river, according to archaeologists, which has dried up. But Foster builds up a mythology in which three rivers, three streams will join together as they do at Allahabad. At least two of them can be seen, but the belief is that all three join. And whatever these three components are, he actually names Saraswati here and Ganga and Jamuna. He names all the three rivers. He is after effecting a kind of a sangam, a kind of a synthesis, a kind of a confluence. And uh, in Ruth Vanita's reading, uh, what she emphasizes is that action and behavior are only outward phenomena. What Foster is after is the meaning which lies behind outward action. And in this sense, there is a Vedantic quest going on in this novel. She takes on a number of earlier critics and says that they have misread the novel. She also contrasts how Hindus and Muslims have mutual distrust. Uh, Pannalal is nervous of Muslims as being fanatics, and Aziz says that Hindus, when their festivals come, become the most fanatical. So these compliments are exchanged. Both have similar feelings about the other religion, as depicted by Foster uh, through some of the minor characters. Aziz is major, but Pannalal is not. Uh, in the novel, the part that she concentrates on, Ruth, is the temple, the last third. The novel has three parts, as you will remember, many of you: mosque, cave, and temple. And temple is Hinduism, mosque is largely Muslim, cave, of course, is the mysterious, even mystical middle. What Ruth points out is that in David Lean's film, for example, and in the eyes of many critics, temple is disregarded. Temple is not given enough importance in interpretations, but in her interpretation, it lies pretty much at the center. I'll just point out that the first part is very long in terms of pages. The second is also fairly long, and the third is very short. And a number of scholars have suggested that the third part was actually added after Foster's second visit to India when he lived with the Hindu Raja and therefore learned more about Hinduism. On the whole, about this novel, as has been pointed out by our panelists, there are many ways of approaching it. There is almost irreducible complexity that attends every theme that Foster takes up. And I think what I find fascinating is, and this applies not only to Foster, but I think to many, many novelists about whom we know what they intended to write, and about whom we also know through their own records, diaries, letters, how they progressed through that, through the realization of that scheme, and how the novel ended up, and the distance between the intention and the accomplishment, and also, of course, how different readers have read it very differently. Mosque, cave, temple, but Foster says it's not about religion. He says it's not about politics, it's only about friendship. Foster says he's following a three-part pattern in the novel, which is not mosque and temple and cave, but which is the three seasons of India, which is, it begins in winter, the novel begins in winter, then comes summer, and in the last part, temple, come the rains. And he talks about universal spiritual themes which rise above politics. But ever since for the last 50 years or so, certainly 40 years easily, there has been a rise in interpretations which are more historical, more materialist, more political, more post-colonial. And all great works undergo that kind of alternating rhythm of interpretation in different ways. Feminist interpretations have also been applied to Foster, apart from these that I've named, these others that I've named. And in this book, too, a number of these points of view are represented. Not only is the book complex, correspondingly, the essays that are gathered together, the 15 essays that are gathered together, all written afresh. In a recent review, somebody said they had read one of the essays before. I think they were dreaming, I think they were fantasizing, I think they were imagining, because all these essays have been written for the first time. They're fresh interpretations, and they've been published here for the first time. So the complexity of the novel may be infinite, and the complexity represented in the interpretations in the 15 essays here may be finite as compared to the novel. But I think together we have done a good job of bringing in many, many perspectives on the novel and showing that there is not only a certain kind of meaning in the book, there is also a very complex treatment of some very complex issues to do with human life, with the Raj, with the kind of spiritualism, with the kind of abstraction, a number of themes in this novel. I think we'll now take some questions, and these will be read out by our organizers of this Zoom meeting. And depending on what the question is, I think one of the panelists or I will respond to it. Srinath?
Thank you so much for a very interesting discussion. We have a few questions.
Yes.
The first one is in the context of Professor Booth's talk on Foster and Kipling. So the question is, Kipling was fairly active as a writer and critic till the early 1930s. Did Kipling address a passage of India specifically as a fellow novelist and critic?
Yes, this is a very good question, given that we have so many comments from Forster on Kipling. What did Kipling say about Forster? And I would love if somebody found one, but I'm not aware of any.
Yes.
And this is not singling Forster out on Kipling's part. We have very few comments that I'm aware of by Rudyard Kipling on modernist writers. He was, yes, active as a writer until the end of his life, mid-1930s, writing his memoir right at the end of his life. But he's not somebody who is engaging in discourse about writing with other writers. What we do have are often brief kind of comments, oral comments, but very little about major modernist writers like Forster. So it's one of those conversations where we only have one side. We don't even know actually that Kipling had read A Passage to India. I suspect he wouldn't have approved, of course, but he kept his powder dry if he read it, giving us any comments at all about what he thought.
Yep. Anyone who finds out from any archive something that Kipling said about Foster will deserve a prize. Yes, the next question, perhaps.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Booth. This is to Professor Jasper. It was mentioned that you did work in India, you taught in India. So the question is, does your experience of living and working in India have a bearing on how you now read A Passage to India?
Well, I can be quite clear about that. Yes, undoubtedly it does. Not least because, of course, I was, as Professor Trivedi has already said, working very close to Patna. And so that the world of the novel, in a certain sense, has a kind of reality to me, which is not given to every, certainly English reader. Having said that, we're talking about a time almost 60 years ago now. So that itself has become, in my memory, sort of mythological in a sense. It was a very different India from present day India, very different. It wasn't all that far away in terms of independence from the British. After all, in the early 70s, we were only a couple of decades away from it, and that was still quite fresh. But undoubtedly, it gives a necessary, ultimately perhaps uncritical element to one's reading, because I mentioned the two British missionaries who are kind of comic characters. We never actually meet them really in the novel, but they're comic characters and treated as fools. They're not fools, actually. Partly because I kind of know those people. I met people very like that. They were decent, hardworking, honest, and undoubtedly odd, because you realize that in that culture, as in the novel, nobody really fits in properly. Everybody is an outsider. Everybody is being displaced in some sense by the complexity of the situation. And I could just finish on a kind of literary note. I mean, increasingly, the work that kind of parallels for me is a slightly earlier work from the very beginning of the 20th century, and that is, of course, The Heart of Darkness. And there's a kind of rather frightening similarity between the boom in the cave and the consequences of that experience or non-experience, and the center of The Heart of Darkness, in a very different but also imperial and continent, the horror. And those two
David, many years have passed. When we read A Passage to India, we want to know which precise city lay behind Chandrapur and where was Mau. Now, do you think you might share with us where exactly near Patna you were?
Well, I was actually, yes, I can. Very, very. I was actually close to Barauni Junction.
I see.
working in a town called Begusarai.
Begusarai, yeah, right.
Which was a very small, rather poor country town. And of course, going up to Patna was going to the great city for us. That was to go and visit the city.
Did you meet anyone at all among Christian priests there who were even remotely like Graceford and Solly?
Yes, and I say that in also not a bad way, but also in a kindly way, because I think there were many people, particularly at that time, many of them had been in India a long time before independence took place, who were genuinely doing a good job. But there was a faint absurdity inherent in the kind of situation, I think, for many. But the answer is yes. And I do recognize the world that we begin the novel with, there's the sort of the British world with all its kind of artificiality and enclosedness. And then there's the world outside that for the British was mysterious.
Srinath?
Next question. This is directed at
Srinath, may I interrupt? Do we have a question from Gaura Narayan, who's a contributor to the book?
Not so far. She hasn't posted so far. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Look out for her. Yeah. Right.
Sure.
Yeah.
So this question goes to all of you on the panel. Is there a trend in how the reading of the novel has changed after the heydays of modernism? So when we are marking 100 years of a passage to India, can we actually identify a trend?
Anjum, would you like to take that up? Hello, Anjum?
Hi,
Anjum?
can you?
Yeah. Would you like to take that question?
I'm not sure if I'm the best person to actually, Harish. Maybe you should, because I haven't actually very closely followed the different readings of the novel, and I think I'm the sort of reader who takes the writer at his word or her word. So
I think that is because you are a novelist yourself, and you would like your readers to take you at your word. Is that right?
Yeah, but at the same time, I do also realize that writers are not the most reliable spokespersons for their own work. But the modernist question, since the modernist period, how have the readings changed? I'm not quite sure.
Okay. Yeah. What I'd say is the words modern and modernist are used even now, even after all the critical discussion of at least 60, 70 years. Virginia Woolf and Foster, who were very dear friends, both within the Bloomsbury group, disagreed about each other's works. They wrote about each other. And Virginia Woolf is definitely called a modern and modernist writer. Foster obviously is a modern writer, but Virginia Woolf thought that he was not a modernist writer, despite his flirtations with symbolism and mysticism, at least mystery, in a novel like A Passage to India. So there was a category. People could be modern because they live in the modern age, but modernist is the technical word, which is to be applied to the arts and literature. And there it conveys a kind of inwardness, a kind of artistic exploration of what lies within characters, within narratives, rather than what meets the eye, which is the realistic, materialist mode of literature. And there have been many, many debates over it. But another perspective on this is, which is not to do with modern and modernist, is how India has changed over these 100 years and how readings of Foster in the West have changed. One must admit that it remains a novel which is read largely in the West. In India, too, prescriptions in the syllabus for this novel have, I think, dropped. They have not gone up. It was read far more widely in colleges and universities, but that is no longer the case. In my own experience, I'm sure is being read and commented on and taught in many, many places in India. After all, I edited an edition for Penguin India, and they would not have asked for a new edition for use here had they not been selling those copies. So that's a good sign. But I think the Raj itself has become something quite distant now for us. Nobody has first-hand experience of it anymore, as there were people when was in 1924, Indians protested against the novel. They thought that Aziz was turned into a clown. Some of them, those who were protesting, Indian students in England, wrote to the papers saying that. Now I think all that feeling is gone. Even if Indian characters are presented as caricatures, or as too comic, who minds? Those times are gone. So that's also what 100 years does to you. We now read it for recovering a kind of historical feeling of that period, and not as something that is of topical relevance to us.
Harish, I wonder if I might make some odds to put a sort of slightly sort of different view there, because I would say actually that I do think A Passage to India is a modernist novel, and I think that my response to the question would be to say that perhaps we now read A Passage to India with much more stress on the narration. We no longer think that the narrator is simple, straightforward, and certainly not Forster. And also, perhaps one of the developments the question was asking about is picking up on what Harish said, is the that opposition between realism and modernism. Perhaps many and high modernist texts, perhaps many texts from this period could in fact be modernist, but do so by reworking, recasting, stretching realist techniques. And if one starts to think about A Passage to India in those terms, I think it could be said to be an experimental text. Just very briefly, there's a thought experiment one can try here, I think, which is to imagine a modernist manifesto. And that manifesto began by saying we need a symbolism of such a radical kind that the symbol doesn't mean something. The symbol means the emptying out of meaning. And we need a narrative innovation so extraordinary that a central part of the plot is omitted. It's not represented, what happens at a key point in the text. Well, that is, of course, A Passage to India. So there is a case that it's an innovative modernist text, just as there's the case that Harish made so well as well.
Could I perhaps also just say a brief word, picking up on both of those things, but particularly Harish? I mean, it does seem to me that particularly the British archetypes I mean, Ronnie, for example, is the sort of public school Christian, which has now become a historical figure. I mean, I'm sure it does exist still, but he's basically, you know, the man who's stiff upper lip. You know, he can't move his mouth in case his pipe will fall out. And his Christianity is learnt from public school. Now, what I think is interesting is the way that you mentioned the David Lean film, which of course is not particularly recent, but those sort of caricatures were played on in the film all the time and made, but it wasn't really, I mean, it wasn't a film of the novel anyway. It was a film of a play about the novel. So, I mean, it wasn't directly from the novel, but it misses the point. And so in a certain sense, the enduring value of A Passage to India transcends those kind of historical limitations, it seems to me. Although popular art and cinema, we still great fun about, you know, laughing at sort of the silly British imperialists. I mean, even speaking as you know, from where I am, they still make quite a good joke, but really they are of history now, as is, you know, Ronnie particularly, I think.
Thank you. Maybe we are really short of time. Maybe two quick questions and we conclude.
Sure.
This is from Professor Gaura Narayan.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. This is to Professor Jasper.
Yes.
Could you say more about the parallel with Heart of Darkness that you raised earlier? Both novels, to my mind, situate themselves on the knife edge of imperialism. Could you please say some more on this?
Yes, I mean, here we're talking about a purely literary echo, and of course, The Heart of Darkness precedes A Passage to India by more than 20 years, but it is essentially the very beginning of the 20th century. And I think it's inescapable to actually read this kind of journey. Each is about a passage from Europe to a continent. On the one hand, the Indian subcontinent, on the other, Africa, at the heart of which is a mystery that completely overwhelms the imperial so-called rulers or power. And so it seems to me that the parallel between those two statements that are so meaningful but utterly bereft of meaning, the boom in the cave, there's nothing you can say, but yet it creates that havoc, as it were, seems to me to be a parallel in a way to the horror that is at the heart of darkness. So it's at a particular moment, really, I think, when Imperial Europe is beginning to encounter something in their domains as they perceived them, whether it was in Africa or India or indeed elsewhere, that was quite beyond them. Was quite beyond them. And I think both novels pick that up very well in different ways, but ultimately, I think, in actually very similar ways.
Yeah, one of the differences, you're very right to point out that Europe is losing its grip on the kind of world that it thought it had under control and is meeting the unexpected, the dark side. Yeah. And the only difference perhaps is that in Passage to India, there is no Mr. Kurtz and he is not dead.
That's perhaps a good thing.
Yeah. Srinath?
Yeah, one final question, and this is to Anjum Hasan.
Yes.
The question is, do you see any connection between Alif in your novel History's Angel and Aziz in A Passage to India?
Well, they have very similar sounding names,
Yeah.
both of 4 letters and both starting with A. But the curious thing is that I'd forgotten all about Aziz till Harish writes saying it's 100 years and we must go back to A Passage to India, and I hadn't actually read it. So it's a very, very interesting question. I hadn't reread the novel when I was writing My History's Angel, which is also about a troubled central character who happens to be Muslim. But I think Aziz is in some ways a figure of his time, like my hero is, but I also am critical about some of the ways in which Foster represents him. And as I said at the beginning, he's shown to be a somehow organic sort of Muslim intellectual who composes poetry, is very nostalgic for the lost glories of Islam. And all of the Western aspects, the fact that he's a doctor, he wears Western clothes, he speaks perfect English, they all seem to be sort of encroachments, even distortions. And that makes him slightly caricaturish to my mind. And what I would argue is that, in fact, he's an Indian modern of a certain kind, and both the nostalgia for Islam and his westernized outlook and get-up are both parts of that modernity. And I think I was trying to do the same thing with Aleph, and it might be that 100 years from now, someone will say you have misrepresented what a Muslim in this era ought to be or was like. But it's a fascinating question. I think to dwell or speculate on what characters might owe each other, and certainly subconsciously Aziz must have been there somewhere in my mind, because like I said, I read the novel very young. Yeah, I think without giving away the ending of my novel for those who haven't read it, I think Aziz has a better end than Alif, but that might simply be because as Foster said in Two Cheers for Democracy, things are getting worse. He said that in the 1940s. I think uh, we are at a much lower ebb now, and so perhaps in some ways mine is a darker novel. But yeah, I wouldn't have dared compared it to Passage ever. So thank you for thank you for the idea.
No, this is delightful.
Speculation.
This is utterly delightful to come to have this circle come round from a novel published only a year and a half ago, I think, and another published 100 years ago, and to see a similarity. Very good question, very smart question to end on, and of course the answer. I thought Foster was dark enough, but Anjum is darker. Yeah. Right,
Foster is
Srinath?
lighter and darker in some ways. Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
that's right. I agree. I agree. Your novel is much dark.
Thank you so much. And I should apologize to listeners who have sent in their questions, but we're really out of time and we can't take any more questions. So, we need to conclude now. I would like to thank all the speakers for their time and for this really engaging conversation that we have had. And thank you to all the people who have tuned in on Zoom as well as on YouTube. Hopefully, you have enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you
Harish.
all.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you, Anjum. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.